There are villages in England whose silence feels less like peace and more like listening. Hamlets where the wind through the trees seems to carry the sighs of the forgotten, and the church bells toll not for worship, but for warning. Among such places lies Blackthorn Hollow, a dale of mist and memory, and the setting for one of the strangest cases ever to test the reason of Sherlock Holmes. It began with a church that breathed. Beneath its stones, whispers were said to stir in the small hours, murmurs rising from the nave as though the earth itself sought confession. Then came the fall of a man from the belfry, a death wrapped in piety and fear. Yet Holmes would soon show that the devil haunting St. Anselm's wore not horns, but the patient smile of human cunning. This is no tale of ghosts, though it began with one. It is the chronicle of how logic descended into superstition's shadow and returned bearing truth like a lamp through the fog. I call it Sherlock Holmes and the Adventure of the Hollow Church. You're listening to Detective Street, where untold mysteries find their voice. And if you enjoy this story, consider subscribing to the channel and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Chapter 1. A Visitor at Baker Street. The morning broke reluctantly over London, as November mornings will, the sun a pale coin behind curtains of slate-grey cloud. I had risen early, my old Afghan wound troubling me with that dull persistence which the damp season invariably provoked, and found Holmes already installed in his customary chair by the fire, a volume of medieval church architecture open upon his knee. The previous evening he had been in one of his discursive moods, holding forth upon the comparative merits of various violin bridges and the acoustic properties of different woods, a monologue which, I confess, had eventually lulled me into a state more receptive to sleep than to scholarly enlightenment. Now, in the thin morning light, he appeared refreshed and alert, his aquiline features sharp with that peculiar intensity which marked the opening stages of intellectual pursuit. Mrs. Hudson had brought up the breakfast things, the silver coffee-pot steaming gently, the toast arranged with her customary precision, and I had just settled myself to the Times when the bell below jangled with an insistence that suggested both urgency and a certain lack of familiarity with our establishment. Holmes's long finger rose immediately to his lips, commanding silence. His grey eyes narrowed as he tilted his head, listening not merely to the bell's summons, but to something deeper, the quality of the footfall now ascending our 17 steps, the particular rhythm of distress. "Anxious step, Watson," said he, his voice pitched low. "Female, I should judge, and young. The tread is light but hurried, and she pauses twice, once at the 7th stair, where the wood creaks, and once at the landing, where she gathers her courage. A gloved hand, too, that doesn't trust the latch. She has tried it 3 times. Observe." I had long since ceased to marvel at these small demonstrations, yet they never failed to command my attention. The door opened, and Mrs. Hudson, her face bearing that expression of maternal concern which she reserved for particularly distressed visitors, ushered in a young lady whose appearance bore out every particular of Holmes's analysis. She was perhaps 25, pale of complexion, but with an underlying resolution in the set of her jaw and the directness of her gaze. Her travelling cloak was of good material, but showed evidence of hasty donning, and tiny droplets of mist clung to its surface like scattered seed pearls. In her gloved hands she clutched a small reticule with such fierce attention that it might have contained all she owned of comfort or hope. "Miss Eleanor Vale," Mrs. Hudson announced, and withdrew with a gentle closing of the door that somehow managed to convey both discretion and encouragement. "Mr. Holmes," the young lady began, her voice carrying the cultured tones of the countryside gentry, yet trembling beneath the surface, like a bow drawn across a string of inferior quality. "Forgive them. Intrusion at such an hour. I have come this morning from Surrey, from the village of Blackthorn Hollow, where our parish church has fallen under a—" She paused, and I saw her throat contract as she swallowed. "Under a horror, sir. They call it the Hollow Church." The last two words fell into the room with a weight that seemed to alter its very atmosphere. Holmes, who had been regarding our visitor with that expression of indulgent gravity which made him irresistible to those in distress, now rose with fluid grace and drew a chair nearer to the fire. "Pray be seated, Miss Vale," he murmured, his tone stripped of any trace of the analytical coldness for which he was sometimes criticized. "Mrs. Hudson's coffee is exceptional, and the morning is raw. Watson, perhaps you would be so good as to pour for our guest. Now, Miss Vale, I beg you will tell us the plain facts of your case and omit nothing, however trifling it may seem. In my experience, the trifles are often the foundations upon which palaces of deduction are built." She accepted the cup I handed her, though her hands trembled slightly as she raised it to her lips. A moment's pause, a gathering of resolution, and then her story emerged with the pent-up force of long-contained anxiety. "Our vicar," she began, "the Reverend Cyrus Lythe, is an elderly gentleman of timid disposition and scholarly inclinations. He has served St. Anselm's these 20 years, and in all that time the parish has been notable chiefly for its quietude. But these last months, Mr. Holmes, that quietude has been shattered. There have been disturbances in the church, noises beneath the nave, as of a low, persistent knocking. Ghostly lights have been observed in the belfry at unseasonable hours. The alms box has been found unlocked on 2 occasions, though no key was taken, and nothing apparently stolen. And worst of all," here her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, "last week, the sexton, poor Abel Pike, fell from the tower to his death." "The authorities," Holmes interjected softly, "call it an accident?" "They do, sir. But I will not believe it. Abel Pike was a cautious man, methodical in all his habits. He had tended that tower for 30 years, and knew every handhold and footfall. Moreover," she set down her cup with a sudden clatter that betrayed the depth of her agitation. "Moreover, my fiancé, Mr. Thomas Grieve, who serves as curate to St. Anselm's, has fallen under suspicion. There are whispers, cruel, baseless whispers, that he coveted the parish plate to fund gambling debts, that he quarrelled with Pike, that he has been observed at odd hours in the church. It is a lie, Mr. Holmes, every word of it. But whispers in a country village have a way of hardening into stones, and I greatly fear, what may come of it." Holmes had steepled his long fingers beneath his chin, his eyes half closed in that attitude of intense concentration which I knew so well. For a long moment he remained silent, and I could almost see the machinery of his remarkable mind sorting, categorizing, eliminating. "Your curate," he said at last, "does he stand to benefit in any material way from the sexton's demise?" "No, sir." The denial burst from her with passionate force. On the contrary, Abel Pike was his staunchest ally in the parish. The old man understood Mr. Grieve's reforming spirit, and supported his efforts to bring the church into closer communion with the village poor. His death has robbed my fiancé of his strongest advocate. I see. And this epithet, the Hollow Church, it derives from some local tradition. Miss Vale's expression shifted, taking on a quality at once fearful and thoughtful. It does, sir. St. Anselm's stands upon very old ground. They say the Danes camped there in ancient times, and later there was a priory of Benedictine monks. The building itself incorporates stones from both periods. Mr. Grieve, who has made something of a study of ecclesiastical architecture, believes there is a crypt or vault beneath the nave. When one stamps upon the floor, particularly near the chancel, the sound that returns is not the solid thud of packed earth, but rather, she hesitated, rather like knocking upon a coffin lid, hollow and echoing. The villagers have always spoken of it with a certain superstitious dread. Holmes rose abruptly and moved to the window, where he stood with his back to us, gazing down into Baker Street. A hansom clattered past, its wheels throwing up spray from the wet pavement. The cabman's whip cracked once, sharply, in the grey air. When Holmes turned back, his face bore that expression of suppressed animation which I had learned presaged action. "An echo," he said, "a death, and a curate in peril. The elements are classic, almost theatrical in their arrangement. Yet I suspect, Miss Vale, that we shall find the drama to be of an entirely earthly composition. Watson, oblige me by packing a bag sufficient for 2 nights. Include your service revolver. Country cases have a way of turning vigorous at their conclusions. Miss Vale, you shall have us on the down train at 4 o'clock. In the meantime, I counsel you to be of stout heart. There is, I think, a very human musician behind your ghostly orchestra, and once we have identified the instrument and the player, the performance will lose much of its terror." I remember the look that transformed her features, simple gratitude mixing with a kind of wondering relief, as if she had passed from shadow into sunlight. It seemed to lighten the very room. Yet as the door closed behind our client and her footsteps receded down the stairs, I observed that the November light falling through our windows had grown flat and grey, leaching the colour from the familiar furnishings of our sitting-room. It was an effect I had noticed before on the eve of our departures, as if London itself withdrew its vibrancy, reserving it for whatever scene awaited us. In the provinces, whatever dark chapter Holmes's peculiar genius would be called upon to illuminate. I turned to find him already at his desk, consulting a railway timetable and making swift notes in his pocket-book. The game, as he was fond of saying, was afoot. Chapter 2. First Footfalls in Blackthorn Hollow. The train bore us southward through a landscape progressively softened by mist, the autumn fields lying fallow beneath a sky that seemed to press downward with the weight of approaching dusk. Holmes had been silent for much of the journey, smoking his pipe and gazing through the carriage window with that abstracted expression which indicated intense internal calculation. Twice he had withdrawn Miss Vale's card from his pocket and examined it with minute attention, though what intelligence he derived from that small rectangle of pasteboard I could not fathom. We reached Blackthorn Hollow as the sun declined behind a rampart of cloud, its final rays casting the village into a chiaroscuro of russet and shadow. The local innkeeper, a florid man who introduced himself as Makepeace, met us at the tiny station with a dog-cart whose lamps cast a yellow, hesitant path through dripping beechwood. The trees pressed close on either side, their branches interlacing overhead to form a tunnel through which we passed with the sound of hoofbeats muffled and strange. "You'll be the London gentleman, then," Makepeace observed, flicking his whip over the horse's ears. "Come about the business at St. Anselm's, I'll warrant. Terrible thing, Mr. Pike's death. Terrible. Though if you ask me—" He paused significantly. "Yes?" Holmes prompted, his voice carefully neutral. "Well, sir, a church that echoes when it ought to be solid. That's been whispered about since my grandfather's time. Old monks don't rest easy. That's what they say. And when you add lights where there oughtn't to be lights, and sounds where there oughtn't to be sounds, well, it's enough to make a man wonder if there isn't something unnatural about the whole business." "Unnatural," Holmes repeated softly. "A word that covers a multitude of very natural sins, I have often found." We emerged from the beechwood into the village proper, a cluster of cottages arranged around a small green, their windows already glowing with lamplight against the gathering darkness. And there, at the edge of the settlement, rising above a low stone wall that bounded the churchyard, stood St. Anselm's itself. The church possessed that quality of menacing stolidity which characterizes Norman architecture at its most uncompromising. The base was squat, thick-walled, with narrow windows that might have served as arrow slits in some defensive tower. Above this foundation, a later perpendicular addition raised a square tower against the darkening sky, its battlements seeming to shake a fist at the heavens. Through the lacing fog that had begun to rise from the nearby river, the building seemed less a house of worship than a presence, something that had stood there, watching for centuries, and would stand watching still when all of us had passed to dust. A shiver ran through me that had nothing to do with the evening cold. Holmes, observing this, smiled faintly. "Atmosphere, Watson. Our adversaries have made excellent use of it. Nothing more." The Reverend Cyrus Lythe awaited us in the vestry, a chamber lined with oak presses and smelling of old leather and beeswax. He proved to be a narrow-shouldered man past 60, with a pendulum underlip and nervous hands that twitched continually toward the heavy ring of keys that hung from his cassock. His eyes, pale and watery behind steel-rimmed spectacles, held the hunted expression of one who has found himself cast in a drama for which he had no preparation, and from which he could discover no exit. With him stood Thomas Grieve, the embattled curate. I liked him at once, a dangerous failing in investigative work, as Holmes had often reminded me. Yet I could not help but respond to the clear-eyed sincerity that marked his every gesture and word. He was perhaps 30, tall and spare, with the kind of unstudied earnestness that wins loyalty from simple folk and suspicion from the sophisticated. His handshake was firm, his gaze direct, and in his voice I heard the strain of a man who has been unjustly accused and who knows that protestation alone will not answer the charge. There, too, in the vestry, I noted a third figure who had not been mentioned in Miss Vale's account. Mr. Caleb Morcar, churchwarden. He was a prosperous-looking man of middle years, his dress speaking of mercantile success, a coat of excellent broadcloth, a cornflower blue cravat secured with a silver pin, and a walking stick whose ivory knob was carved in the shape of a lion's head. His gaze measured Holmes as a cloth merchant might measure fabric, calculating quality and worth with the swift assessment of long commercial practice. "Mr. Holmes," the vicar began, his voice quavering slightly, "it is good of you to come. Most good. This terrible business, poor Pike, and the whispers about Mr. Grieve, I confess I am quite at a loss. Quite at a loss. Facts will serve us better than distress, Holmes replied, not unkindly. With your permission, I should like to make a circuit of the church before we lose the last of the light. The scene itself will tell us more than any description, however careful. We moved from the vestry into the body of the church, and I was immediately struck by the temperature, a thin, penetrating cold that seemed to hang like a pall, as if the very air had been chilled by some refrigerating process. The nave stretched before us, its flagstones worn smooth by centuries of prayerful traffic. Where the centre of the aisle caught the last light from the western windows, the stones shone with a faint lustre, like worn ivory or old bone. The pews on either side stood in dim ranks, their carved ends barely visible in the gathering shadows. Holmes moved forward slowly, his stick tapping lightly against the flagstones. The sound echoed strangely in that vaulted space, but not uniformly. At certain points along the central aisle, the tap produced a flat, dead sound, the acoustic of stone meeting solid earth. But twice, once near the font and once some yards before the chancel step, the tap was answered by something different. A queer resonance, a hollowness that seemed to speak of empty space beneath our feet. "You hear it, Watson?" Holmes inquired, pausing at the second location. "I do," said I, conscious now of a prickling at the back of my neck that had nothing to do with the cold. Hollow, indeed, as if there were a chamber below. Holmes knelt at the spot where two large flagstones met, their junction marked by a hairline seam barely visible in the fading light. He passed one long finger along the crack, then raised it to his nose and sniffed with the delicate precision of a wine connoisseur assessing a vintage. "Grit," he murmured. "Common enough in a country church, but observe, Watson." He extended his finger toward me. "A tang of salt, quite unmistakable." "Salt!" I exclaimed, keeping my voice low. "But how?" "Precisely the question. Salt implies proximity to tidal water, yet we are some miles from the sea. The riverway, however, runs not a quarter-mile from where we stand, and it is tidal to this point during the spring floods." He rose, his eyes bright with speculation. "Mr. Grieve, you keep flowers in the nave." The curate, who had been following our progress with anxious attention, shook his head. "Not at this season, sir. Only oil for the lamps in the vestry, and candles for the services." "Then it is not from a pious gardener's tearful watering can," Holmes observed, more to himself than to us. His grey eyes narrowed as he surveyed the nave from his position near the chancel, taking in the arrangement of the building, the relationship of the parts, the way the shadows fell. I could see his mind assembling the physical evidence into some larger pattern, though its outline remained obscure to me. "The belfry," he said abruptly. "I should like to examine the tower." The narrow stair wound upward through stone walls thick enough to have withstood siege. The steps were worn in the centre, hollowed by generations of ascent, and our progress was slow in the near darkness. Grieve carried a lantern, its flame dancing and smoking as we climbed, throwing monstrous shadows against the ancient masonry. The ringing chamber, when we reached it, was a square space beneath the bells themselves, with louvered openings that admitted the evening wind in cold gusts. The ropes hung in a neat row, their sallies bright with new wool. Holmes examined each in turn, running his hands over the cordage with the attention of a sailor inspecting his ship's rigging. The ladder to the bell chamber proper was sound, though ancient, oak beams worn smooth by use, but on one rung, approximately at shoulder height for a man of average stature, Holmes paused. He drew a clean handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed at a greasy smear that darkened the wood. "Observe," he said, holding the handkerchief to his nose. "Paraffin, not the refined oil used for church lamps, but common lamp fuel, the cheap variety sold for use in cottages and workshops. The sexton's habit, perhaps, Mr. Grieve?" "Pike was meticulous in his habits," the curate answered. "He would never have brought common lamp fuel into the church. He took pride in maintaining the proper dignity of the place." "Indeed." Holmes descended and stood looking upward at the bells themselves, 4 of them, their bronze surfaces dulled by age, and the corrosive salt air that penetrated even here. "And yet someone has climbed this ladder recently, someone whose hands or clothing bore this substance. Interesting." Mr. Morcar, who had followed us up the tower with surprising agility for a man of his years and comfortable circumstances, now interjected with the faintest curl of his lip. "A careless man might bring such drippings from the inn, Mr. Holmes. Makepeace is notoriously lax in his trimming of wicks. Pike himself may have brushed against such a lamp when last he visited the Sable Heart." Holmes offered him a look as bland as milk. "Quite so. It is a possibility that must be entertained." Yet I noted that he folded the handkerchief carefully and placed it in his inner pocket, and I knew that the paraffin had told him something that he was not yet prepared to share. Last, we were shown Abel Pike's body, which had been laid out in a side room of the vicarage adjacent to the church. The poor fellow lay beneath a clean sheet, his hands crossed upon his breast in the attitude of peaceful repose that undertakers favour, though there was nothing peaceful in the circumstances of his death. At Holmes's request, Grieve drew back the covering. Pike had been a man of perhaps 50, sturdy of build, with the weathered features of one who had spent his life in outdoor labour. But the right side of his brow was marred by a terrible bruising, a dark purple contusion that extended from above the ear to the temple. The limbs bore scratches, particularly along the forearms, but they lacked the brutal contortions and massive compound fractures that would characterize a fall of any considerable distance. Holmes examined the hands with particular attention, turning them gently in the lamplight, studying the palms and the crescents of the nails. I saw him pause, his eyes narrowing, and then with great tenderness he arranged the shroud once more and drew it up to cover the dead man's face. "What distance did he fall?" Holmes asked quietly. "From near the bell," Grieve answered, his voice thick with emotion. 40 feet, perhaps. Certainly no less." Holmes nodded slowly, saying nothing. But I saw in his expression a certainty that had not been there before, the look of a man who has read a message written in a language known only to himself. "We will visit the tower again by lantern after midnight," he said at last. "The dead tell their tale most clearly when the living are abed, and I suspect that St. Anselm's has secrets that reveal themselves only in the small hours." He turned to Grieve. "Can you arrange for us to have access to the church at that hour without arousing undue notice?" "I can, sir. I have my own key." "Excellent. Watson, we shall return to the inn for the present. A hot meal and some reflection upon what we have seen will serve us well. Mr. Lyth, Mr. Grieve, gentlemen, Until midnight, then. We made our way through the churchyard as full darkness descended, the gravestones leaning at drunken angles in the fog, their inscriptions blurred by lichen and time. Behind us, St. Anselm's tower rose like a judge above a dock, its battlements ragged against the last grey gleam of the western sky. I felt upon my shoulders the weight of its watching presence, and I was grateful when we passed beyond the churchyard wall and into the relative normalcy of the village street. The inn provided supper, mutton pie and strong ale, and we took it in a private parlour whose small fire did little to dispel the damp. The wind had freshened toward 11 o'clock, worrying the wooden signboard on its bracket outside our window, making it creak and bang in irregular rhythm. In the common room below, I could hear the rumble of village conversation, and once the landlord Makepeace's voice rose above the general murmur. Lights in the tower, I tell you, and voices under the church, as if the old monks was prayin', but in a tongue that sets the spine to rattlin'. Holmes, who had been smoking in silence, his eyes fixed upon the fire, now touched my sleeve. "When the world chooses ghosts, Watson," he murmured, "it is often because it would rather not choose men. Superstition is a comfortable shield against uncomfortable truths. Our task is to strip away that shield and reveal what stands behind it, however little the world may thank us for the service." He rose and moved to the window, drawing aside the curtain to peer into the darkness. The street was empty, the fog thickening into a dense white blanket that obscured everything beyond 20 paces. Somewhere in that obscurity stood St. Anselm's, waiting. I drew on my coat and checked my revolver, a precaution that had served me well in the past, and together we stepped out into the night. The fog muffled sound, transforming our footsteps into something secret and furtive. The churchyard gate creaked as we pushed through, and then we were among the graves, moving carefully between the tilted stones. The tower loomed before us, darker than the darkness, its presence felt rather than seen. The hour had come for evidence to speak in its own cold grammar, and I felt in my breast that mixture of apprehension and excitement which always attended the decisive phases of Holmes's investigations. Grieve met us at the south door, a hooded lantern in his hand, his face pale but resolute. "All is quiet within," he whispered. "I have been here this half-hour, and have heard nothing." Holmes nodded and took the lantern. "Then, let us see what the church will tell us when we listen properly." We entered, and the darkness swallowed us whole. Chapter 3. Red Herrings in the Nave. Midnight in St. Anselm's, and the church had become an arc of shadow floating upon an invisible sea. Our lanterns made small islands of illumination. Here, a pew end carved with the face of some forgotten saint. There, a pillar rising into vaulted darkness. Everywhere else, the gulf of black into which our eyes could not penetrate. The cold had intensified, as if the building itself were exhaling some frigid breath drawn from deep within the earth. Holmes moved ahead with that feline economy of movement which marked him in moments of intense focus. He made no unnecessary sound, yet neither did he creep. It was rather that he moved with complete awareness of his own body in space, placing each foot with instinctive precision. He paused at the spot where, earlier that evening, the flagstone had produced its hollow resonance. He held up one hand for silence, then doused his own lantern and motioned for us to do the same. Grieve and I complied, and the darkness became absolute, thick, textured, almost palpable. I could hear my own breathing, the distant sigh of wind through the tower vents, and beneath it all, the peculiar silence of a large enclosed space. Then, distinct as a hammer blow, it came. Thock, thock, thock. A dull, rhythmic knocking from beneath our feet, regular as a heartbeat, patient as stone. It had the quality of purposeful work, metal against wood, or wood against stone. The sound of a craftsman about his business in the depths. Grieve started forward, but Holmes's hand shot out and grasped his arm with surprising strength. "No bravado, if you please," he whispered, his lips close to the curate's ear. "We must observe the pattern, not merely its existence. Sound travels strangely in enclosed spaces. What we hear directly above us may originate 20 feet distant. Patience." We stood like statues in the blackness, and gradually my eyes began to adjust, finding the faint grey of the windows against the surrounding dark, the suggestion of the chancel arch, the pale gleam of brass upon the lectern. The knocking continued. 10 strokes, then a pause. 10 more, another pause. A code, perhaps, or merely the rhythm of some mechanical process. Then it ceased. The silence that followed was somehow more oppressive than the noise had been. We waited, counting heartbeats, and then I heard it. A different sound, very soft. The rattle of a chain drawn through metal rings, the wet slide of something heavy moving across stone. Holmes's breath, barely audible, warmed the cold air beside my ear. "A winch," he breathed, "and water near at hand. Feel the air, Watson. Hold your hand before your face, and feel." I did so, and felt it distinctly. A current of cold, damp air rising from the floor, as if a window had been opened below ground. It carried with it a smell I knew, the reek of tidal weed, the iron tang of river water, the musty odour of ancient stone that has known centuries of moisture. Before I could frame a response, a faint glow appeared near the base of the chancel step, a sickly yellow gleam, as of a lamp whose wick has been turned low. It swam beneath the floor like something seen through murky water, shifted laterally perhaps 2 feet, then died away. In the darkness that followed, I heard the infinitely small creak of a hinge whose pins have been recently oiled. Holmes's fingers closed around my wrist with the intensity of iron. "Back," he mouthed soundlessly, and together we ghosted into the south transept, finding by touch the narrow stair that led to the gallery above the nave. Grieve followed, moving with the practiced silence of one who knows every irregularity of his own church. From our elevated position, we commanded a view of the entire nave, or would have done, had there been sufficient light to see by. We waited, and I felt time stretch and slow in that peculiar way it has when danger lurks invisible and the nerves are strung to their highest pitch. My hand found the reassuring weight of my revolver, and I drew it slowly from my pocket, careful to make no sound. Beside me, Holmes was utterly still, his attention focused upon the darkness below, with an intensity I could feel emanating from him, like heat from a stove. The glow came again, stronger now. 2 lanterns, hooded, but not completely concealed. In their indirect radiance, I saw a square of floor near the lectern soften at its edges, as if the stone itself were becoming flexible. Then, with infinite care, the section tilted upward on some hidden pivot, moved perhaps 6 inches, and settled back flush with the surrounding pavement. The movement was so smooth, so practiced, that I understood immediately we were witnessing not the first performance of this maneuver, but rather a well-rehearsed procedure executed many times before. There was no human hand visible. Whoever operated the mechanism did so from below, and with considerable sophistication. The stone lay flush once more, its seam invisible in the dim light. After perhaps 5 minutes, during which we scarcely dared breathe, the glow came again, fainter now, more distant, and then died completely. We waited out that chill hour in absolute silence until the first grey intimation of dawn began to pale the eastern windows. At last, Holmes laid a hand upon my shoulder and nodded toward the stairs. We descended carefully, examined the area around the lectern, and found nothing. The flagstones were as solid and immovable as they had appeared by daylight. Yet Holmes knelt and, producing a magnifying lens from his pocket despite the poor light, examined the seams with minute attention. "Observe," he said softly to Grieve. "Here, where the mortar should show uniform weathering, there are small crescents of newer material. See how it catches the light differently. This stone has been lifted and reset, and more than once. The workmanship is excellent, but not quite perfect. There is always some signature of interference, if one knows where to look." We made our way to the vestry, where a dim lamp burned before a plaster saint. The board upon which the various keys hung presented an orderly array, each tagged with its function: sacristy, alms-box, tower, coal cellar. Holmes selected the tower key and examined it with his lens, then touched it to his lip. "Beeswax," he murmured, "freshly applied, within the week, I should judge. Now why would one wax a key? 2 reasons suggest themselves: either to keep it from squealing in the ward when turned surreptitiously, or to make a temporary cast from which a duplicate might be made. Which man in this parish, Mr. Grieve, keeps beeswax readily upon his person?" The curate flushed slightly. "The organist, Mr. Jericho. He maintains it for the reeds of his instrument, and—" He hesitated. "Yes," Holmes prompted gently. "And the beekeeper, Samuel Cross, who supplies the church candles. But Cross is 70 if he's a day, and can barely climb the church steps." "Then we shall direct our attention to Mr. Jericho," Holmes said, replacing the key with care. "Tell me about him." "He is a capable musician," Grieve answered slowly, choosing his words with evident discomfort. "A man of refined taste, educated beyond what one might expect in a parish of this size. He came to us 3 years ago from Guildford, where he had been assistant organist at the cathedral. His references were excellent. And his habits? Grieve paused. "There has been talk. Cards at the Sable Hart, on the Guildford Road. Debts, perhaps, but I have no direct knowledge." Holmes's gaze had already moved on to other items in the vestry. In the corner, half hidden by a stack of prayer books, lay a coil of rope, perhaps 20 feet in length. Holmes lifted it, examined the end, and held it to the lamp. The fibres bore a russet staining that might have been rust, but which, under his lens, proved to be something else entirely. "Not rust," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Brick powder with mica, the distinctive composition of the old Roman tiles used to line river culverts in this county. Unmistakable to one who has made a study of such matters." He looked at Grieve with sudden intensity. "Your sexton, Mr. Pike, when his body was found, were his hands examined?" I believe not, beyond what was necessary to lay him out." "Come." We returned to the vicarage and to the room where Pike lay. Holmes drew back the shroud once more and examined the dead man's hands with meticulous care, turning them this way and that in the lamplight. Under the nails of both hands, barely visible unless one looked with deliberate attention, were thin crescents of reddish-brown material. "Brick dust," Holmes said quietly, scraping a minute sample onto a slip of paper he had produced from his pocketbook. "The same composition as upon that rope. Abel Pike did not fall from the tower, gentlemen. He was killed. Elsewhere, somewhere he struggled against stone or brick, and his body was taken to the belfry and dropped at dawn to simulate an accidental fall. But observe the bruising. It is concentrated above the right ear and upon the brow, precisely where a short, murderous blow with a weighted instrument would land if delivered by a right-handed assailant of approximately 6 feet in height. I have seen such work too often in the rookeries of London to mistake it. The contusions upon the limbs came after death, from the fall itself, but the fatal injury preceded the fall by some hours. The absence of massive skeletal damage confirms what the bruising pattern suggests. This man was already dead when his body struck the ground." The curate's face had gone white. "Then it is murder." "It is murder, most foul," Holmes agreed, "and murder in service of some larger scheme. Pike discovered something. Perhaps the waxed key. Perhaps the movement of goods through the church at night. Perhaps he followed a light and came too close to the truth. He was silenced, and silenced in such a way as to appear an accident. But our adversaries could not control every detail. The brick dust remained beneath his nails, and the pattern of injury speaks its own language to those trained to read it." We returned once more to the tower, and this time Holmes examined not the ladder, but the bells themselves. The ropes hung in their accustomed places, but now, in the strengthening dawn light, I could see what had been invisible in darkness. On the rope of the tenor bell, perhaps 8 inches below the sally, a short side line had been spliced in, a thin cord no thicker than a finger, easily overlooked by any casual observer. "A signalling device," Holmes said, demonstrating how the slightest tug upon this auxiliary line would cause the bell to emit not a full peal, but rather a muted knock, audible at a distance, but not loud enough to constitute a general alarm. A conversation between Nave and river, conducted in a language of taps and responses. The bell, Mr. Grieve, is an ear, and those below have been listening. The dawn was fully upon us now, the fog thinning to reveal the village in shades of grey and gold. Smoke rose from cottage chimneys. A cock crowed with absurd optimism. The ordinary world was waking to its ordinary concerns, unknowing of the dark machinery we had glimpsed in motion beneath the floor of its parish church. Holmes gathered us in the vestry. "We must proceed carefully," he said. "Our adversaries are numerous, at least 3, I calculate, from the efficiency of the operation and the need for coordination between the river landing and the church interior. They are also desperate, as Pike's murder demonstrates. They will not hesitate to strike again if they feel themselves threatened. Therefore, we must give them no alarm until we are ready to close the trap completely." "What would you have us do?" Grieve asked. "Maintain your ordinary routines. Give no sign that anything is amiss. If you are approached, if any attempt is made to intimidate you, note every detail, but do not resist. Watson and I will continue our investigations, but we shall do so with apparent aimlessness, as tourists might, interested in the architectural curiosities of your ancient church. We are looking for the mechanism by which that flagstone is operated, for the extent of the vault or tunnel beneath, and most particularly for the identity of the man who holds the keys to this infernal machine. With that, we dispersed, Grieve to his curate's duties, Holmes and I ostensibly to our inn for breakfast. But I noted that Holmes's eyes, as we crossed the churchyard in the strengthening light, never ceased their restless catalogue of detail. The position of windows, the relationship of the church to the river path, the coming and going of villagers about their morning business. We spent the day in what appeared to be desultory exploration. We walked the river path, where Holmes paused frequently to examine the bank, the quality of the soil, the presence of roots and rocks that might betray the existence of underground workings. We visited the church again, this time with a request to see the registers, and while I engaged the verger in conversation, Holmes managed to examine the underside of the hinged flagstone from the crypt access in the tower base, an expedition that left him covered in cobwebs, but highly satisfied. "There is a shaft," he told me later, speaking low as we made our way back to the inn. "It descends perhaps 15 feet to what I take to be a horizontal passage. The engineering is old, very old, but the pulley system by which the stone is operated is quite modern. Brass fittings, steel cable. Our criminals have adapted an ancient passage to contemporary use with considerable ingenuity." That afternoon brought interviews of a more formal nature. We spoke with Mr. Jericho, the organist, who received us in his cottage, a tidy establishment whose furnishings spoke of refined taste operating within narrow means. He was a man of perhaps 40, with sharp cuffs that showed too much wrist and hollow cheeks that suggested either asceticism or privation. His long fingers, as he gestured in conversation, moved with the particular grace of the trained musician, and his voice carried the careful modulation of one who has studied elocution. When Holmes mentioned the disturbances at the church, Jericho's response was immediate and apparently sincere. "A profanation," he said, his pale eyes flashing with genuine anger. "St. Anselm's is a jewel of ecclesiastical architecture, a sanctuary that has offered solace to generations. To use it for whatever purpose these villains intend, is an offence against both God and man." "You have heard these noises yourself?" Holmes inquired mildly. "Once only. I was practicing late, a week before Mr. Pike's death, and I heard something beneath the nave. A scraping sound, as of heavy objects being dragged. I reported it to the vicar, but he—" Jericho paused delicately. "Mr. Leith is not a man of decisive action." "And you have no theory as to the source of these disturbances?" Jericho spread his hands. "In a building of this age, there are many possible explanations. Settling of foundations, the movement of water through underground channels, even the activity of burrowing animals. I am a musician, Mr. Holmes, not a detective. I can only report what I heard." We took our leave, and I thought I detected in Holmes's expression a certain satisfaction, though whether it stemmed from belief or disbelief in Jericho's account, I could not determine. Next, we interviewed the verger, a stooped man of perhaps 50, who went by the improbable name of Caleb's cousin Job. He proved to be either genuinely simple or an excellent actor, blinking at our questions with bovine incomprehension and offering only that the dead should lie easy if they're left alone, and those that poke about in graveyards after dark deserve what they get. "Have you seen anyone poking about after dark?" Holmes asked. Job's face took on a cunning expression. "I sees what I sees, and I says nothing. That's how a man keeps his place." "Very wise," Holmes murmured. "And if you should see anything further, that troubles you?" "I'll see nothing," Job said flatly. "Nothing at all." Our final interview of that day was with Mr. Caleb Morcar, the churchwarden, whom we encountered taking his constitutional along the river path. His silver-knobbed cane tapped rhythmically against the ground as he walked, and his cornflower cravat was crisp despite the damp. He greeted us with the urbane courtesy of the successful provincial merchant, a man accustomed to being deferred to in parish matters. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. Taking the air, I see. Our Blackthorn Hollow is not London, but it has its charms." "Indeed it does," Holmes agreed. "We've been admiring your church, a remarkable building." "St. Anselm's is the pride of the parish," Morcar said, with the proprietary air of one who has contributed substantially to the maintenance fund. "Though this recent unpleasantness with poor Pike, most unfortunate. An accident, of course, but accidents in a church generate unhealthy speculation." "You believe it was an accident, then?" Morcar's eyes, which were a cold grey, despite the geniality of his manner, rested upon Holmes for a moment longer than was quite comfortable. "What else should it be?" Pike was getting on in years. A moment's carelessness on that ladder, a dizzy spell perhaps. These things happen. As for the talk of ghosts and mysterious noises, I attribute it to the excitable nature of country folk, and perhaps to the influence of certain parties who ought to know better. "You refer to the curate?" "I refer to no one specifically," Morcar said smoothly. "But ardent young men with reforming spirits sometimes see melodrama where country good sense would suffice. Mr. Grieve is doubtless sincere in his concerns, but sincerity and judgment are not always companions." He paused, then added with studied casualness, "Ardent fellows are dangerous with keys, Mr. Holmes. Dangerous with keys, and dangerous with other people's money." It was a calculated thrust, and Holmes parried it with equal skill. "Just so," he said, his tone conveying agreement without commitment. "We must all be careful with keys." As we walked back toward the village, leaving Morcar to continue his constitutional, Holmes was silent for some moments. Then he said quietly, "A most interesting gentleman. Did you observe his cane?" "The silver knob? Yes, well made and expensive." "More than that, Watson. The ferrule, the metal tip, bore fresh mud of a particular reddish-brown composition. The same, I'll wager, as lines the river culverts. And the time was 11 in the morning, when the lanes were dry from a night without rain. One does not acquire fresh river mud at 11 in the morning unless one has walked the river path before breakfast. And why should a gentleman of Mr. Morcar's standing take such a walk in November before dawn, unless he had particular business there?" "You think he is involved?" "I think," Holmes said carefully, "that Mr. Morcar bears watching. There is something in his manner, a confidence, a sense of command, that suggests a man accustomed to organizing complex affairs, and his comment about keys was hardly accidental. He was testing me, Watson, trying to determine how much we know and how seriously we take the curate's suspicions." That evening, as the sun declined and the fog began once more to rise from the river, a small boy darted from behind a yew tree in the churchyard and thrust a folded paper into Grieve's hand before fleeing like a startled rabbit. It was Jem Stokes, the bellboy, whose fox-like face I had noticed earlier in the day. Holmes plucked the paper from Grieve's palm and opened it. The message was brief, written in a jagged, barely literate scrawl. "Midnight." No more. They watched the water. Holmes read it twice, then looked up at the darkening sky. "They?" he repeated thoughtfully. Pronouns, Watson, are the bandages of cowards. We must close with nouns, with names, faces, and the particular details that transform suspicion into certainty. That night promised either clarity or violence, perhaps both. My own mind was a tumult of speculation. I understood now that we were dealing not with supernatural forces, but with a criminal enterprise of considerable sophistication, one that had adapted an ancient structure to modern criminal purposes, that had murdered to protect its secrets, and that would not hesitate to murder again if its operations were threatened. The young curate's danger was real, the threat to Miss Vale's happiness substantial. And somewhere in this web of conspiracy sat a spider whose identity remained tantalizingly out of reach. The fog thickened, evening became night, wrapping the village in a white silence that muffled sound and reduced the world to a series of disconnected pools of lamplight. Through my window at the inn, I could see the tower of St. Anselm's rising above the general obscurity, its battlements jagged against the lighter darkness of the sky. Somewhere in that ancient building, beneath its worn flagstones and within its secret spaces, lay the answers we sought. I checked my revolver once more, ensured my dark lantern was in working order, and settled down to wait for the hour that would bring either resolution or disaster. Holmes sat across from me, his pipe glowing in the darkness, his mind already racing ahead to the confrontation that must come. The decisive hour of the case approached, and with it came that familiar tightening at the heart, that mixture of dread and anticipation that had attended so many of our adventures. Whatever lay ahead, I knew that before another dawn broke over Blackthorn Hollow, the Hollow Church would surrender its secrets, or we would pay the price for having sought them too boldly. Chapter 4. The Violin and the Vault. Holmes spent the better part of the afternoon in pursuits he did not fully explain, returning to the inn at tea-time with a shabby black bag that I recognized as containing his portable chemistry set and various other implements of investigation. His eyes held that particular gleam of suppressed animation that indicated he had reached some crucial understanding, and his movements had taken on the coiled energy of a cat preparing to spring. "A trifle of chemistry," he said, setting the bag upon the table with a decisive thump. "A hint of acoustics and a dollop of superstition. We shall make our own ghost tonight, Watson, and in doing so, we shall exorcise the false phantoms that others have created for profit and protection. You have a plan, then?" "I have several plans," he replied, "arranged in order of preference, but with contingencies at every stage. Our adversaries have shown themselves to be resourceful and ruthless. We must be more so, but we must also be prepared for violence. You have your revolver?" I patted my pocket. "Loaded and ready." "Good. We may need it, though I confess I prefer to conclude these affairs with reason rather than force. Still, one must be practical." He began removing items from the bag, his Stradivarius in its battered case, several small bottles, papers of powder, a coil of thin wire, and what appeared to be a bellows of the type used by photographers. "The church," he continued, "is not merely a building, but an instrument. It has been played like a violin by our criminals, and they have drawn from it sounds calculated to inspire fear and credulity. Tonight we shall play our own notes and see what responses we receive." At 11 o'clock we made our way once more through the fog-wrapped streets to St. Anselm's. Grieve met us at the south door, his face pale but determined. With him was the bellboy Jem, who had insisted, with the fierce courage of youth, upon being present at whatever action might unfold. "I knows the church," the boy had argued to Grieve, "every stone and every shadow, and I can move quiet as a mouse when needs be." Holmes had studied the lad with those penetrating grey eyes, then nodded. "Very well. But you will remain in the gallery, unless I specifically summon you. If violence erupts, you will flee immediately and raise the alarm at the inn. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Jem had replied, his fox face solemn with the weight of responsibility. Now we entered the nave, and once more the peculiar cold of that space enveloped us. Holmes had brought his violin, and the sight of it in that solemn ecclesiastical setting struck me as faintly sacrilegious, though I knew that Holmes himself would have found such a sentiment amusing. He tuned the instrument softly, the pure notes falling into the darkness and returning with strange harmonics from the vaulted ceiling. Then, beginning near the font, he drew from it a continuous low note, a tone that seemed to sink into the very stones and return upon itself, creating a resonance that made the air itself vibrate. He moved slowly down the central aisle, altering his footing by inches, pausing, listening, moving again. The sound he produced was not music, but rather a form of acoustic interrogation, a systematic probing of the space to determine where it was solid and where it concealed emptiness. Twice he stopped completely, and with a stick of chalk he had produced from his pocket, he marked pale X's upon the flagging. "There," he whispered, "lies the rib of the vault, the supporting member that prevents collapse. And there—" he marked another spot. "There is the hinge, or very near it. The stone is not uniformly joined to its neighbours, but rather sits within a frame that permits movement." From his bag he produced a small bottle containing what he explained was finely ground lampblack mixed with common flour. This powder he sprinkled along the seam he had earlier examined, working it into the crack with a thin blade. "A crude spirometer," he explained in response to my questioning look, "for measuring the respiration of churches. Where air is drawn downward through the crack, the flour will settle and disappear. Where it is expelled, as it must be when that stone is lifted, the lampblack will cling to the moistened edges and leave a visible trace. If our theory is correct, this seam breathes, Watson. It inhales and exhales with the operation of the mechanism below." We took our station behind the organ, whose massive bulk provided both concealment and a vantage point that commanded much of the chancel. The bellows of the instrument loomed beside us in the darkness like some sleeping beast. Grieve and young Jem positioned themselves in the gallery above, from which they could observe without being easily observed. Midnight tolled from the tower above us, the tenor bell, whose rope we knew now held a secret auxiliary line, counting out the hour with sonorous finality. We waited in absolute silence, and gradually the quality of the darkness seemed to change. My eyes, adapting to the minimal light, began to distinguish shapes, the pale gleam of brass upon the lectern, the suggestion of carved faces on the pew ends, the faint grey rectangles of the windows. Presently, it might have been 10 minutes after the last stroke of midnight, though time had become elastic and unreliable, I heard the careful scrape of a key in a lock. The sound came not from the main doors, but from the vestry, and it was followed by the barely audible creak of hinges, well oiled, but still betraying their motion to attentive ears. A darker darkness moved across the chancel. A human form, moving with the confidence of one who knows his ground. Then a second figure appeared, this one carrying a dark lantern whose light had been reduced to a mere slit. The faint illumination revealed a heavy-shouldered man with a strip of red scarf at his throat. A city type, to judge from his bearing and dress, and not a man I would care to meet in a dark alley. There followed a whispered exchange, the words indistinguishable but the tones clear enough. One voice bearing the roughened edge of London's East End, the other more educated, more local. My heart began to beat more rapidly. Holmes's hand found my sleeve and squeezed once. Wait. The second man, whom I now recognized by his profile as Jericho, the organist, knelt by the flagstone Holmes had marked. His long fingers felt along the seam, found something that appeared to satisfy him, and pressed. I heard a faint click as of a well-made lock opening, and then the stone began to rise. It moved smoothly, tilted on its hidden pivot, and revealed a square of darkness from which rose that now familiar draught of cold, damp air, redolent of river water and ancient stone. The slit of light from the dark lantern probed the opening, and I caught a glimpse of iron rungs descending into blackness. Holmes moved then with startling suddenness. He stepped from behind the organ, not as himself, but as a bent parish beadle, affecting a pronounced limp and holding his own dark lantern at such an angle that it illuminated his face from below, casting grotesque shadows and transforming his features into a gargoyle mask. "Who's there?" he whined, his voice pitched high and querulous. "Who's that in the Lord's house at this ungodly hour? Shame, shame upon you." The effect was immediate and satisfying. The city man whirled, his hand diving into his coat. For a weapon, I had no doubt. Jericho, still kneeling by the opening, looked up with an expression of pure horror. "Damn your house!" the city man hissed, his voice thick with menace and a vocabulary that confirmed his origins in London's less savoury quarters. "Go home, old rat, before you get hurt." But Jericho, recovering his presence of mind, grabbed the other man's arm. "Quiet, for God's sake," he whispered urgently. "It's just old Job the verger. He's simple. He won't—" He never finished the sentence. Holmes's transformation was instantaneous and complete. The limp vanished as if it had never existed, and he flung wide the hood of his lantern so that light sprang across the chancel in a brilliant flood, catching faces and stone in sharp relief. "Down! Down, Watson!" he cried, his voice now his own, commanding, urgent, electric with controlled violence. I emerged from concealment, my revolver in hand, and together we plunged into the sudden pandemonium that erupted in that sanctified space. The city man, quicker and more desperate than his companion, leapt for the opening in the floor, clearly intending to escape down the passage below. But Holmes, moving with the precision of a fencer, took him behind the knee with a sweeping blow of his stick, and the fellow went down headfirst with a curse that echoed obscenely from the vaulted ceiling. He slithered into the throat of the passage, his hands scrabbling, for purchase on the smooth stone edges, and for a moment I thought he would disappear entirely into that black maw. But his bulk wedged in the opening, and his struggles only served to lodge him more firmly. Jericho, meanwhile, had sprung not toward the passage, but away from it, making for the vestry door and whatever escape route lay beyond. He was quick and desperate, but he had not reckoned on the presence of Thomas Grieve, who descended from the gallery with remarkable agility and intercepted the organist at the chancel arch. What followed was a brief but fierce struggle. Grieve, though not a large man, possessed the strength of righteous anger and the advantage of position. He caught Jericho around the waist and held on with the tenacity of a terrier, even as the organist struck at him with surprising violence. Then young Jem, white-faced but steady, came pelting down from the gallery, trailing the loose end of the tenor bell's rope. With a presence of mind that would have done credit to a man thrice his age, he swung the weighted sally like a weapon and brought it crashing against Jericho's shoulder. The organist howled and went to his knees, and Grieve, panting, managed to pinion his arms. "The stone!" Holmes shouted. "Close it, Jem! Now!" The boy darted to the opening, and bracing his feet against the floor, heaved at the tilted flagstone. For a moment it seemed it would not move. The city man's bulk held it partially open, and his muffled curses rose from below, like the growling of some trapped beast. But then, with a strength born of terror and determination, Jem gave a final heave. The stone descended with inexorable force, and the man in the passage, feeling its weight upon his shoulders, howled and tried to squirm backward. The stone settled flush with a grinding sound, and the howling ceased abruptly, cut off as if by a knife. I had my revolver trained on Jericho, covering him, while Grieve and young Jem bound his hands with the bell rope Holmes had earlier identified as the signalling device. The organist had ceased his struggles, and sat now with lowered eyes, breathing heavily, his refined features twisted with an expression that mingled fear and something like despair. "Two," Holmes panted, his usual composure slightly disordered by the violence of the struggle. "But where is three?" He raised his lantern and cast its beam into the galleries, into the shadows of the transepts, searching. And in that instant I saw a flicker of movement in the north aisle, a figure that had remained hidden until this moment, watching, waiting, now seeing that the game was lost and making for the vestry door. But Holmes was quicker. "Morcar!" he cried. "Stand, sir, or I swear I will bring you down." The churchwarden, for it was indeed Caleb Morcar, his cornflower cravat gleaming incongruously in the lantern light, did not stand. Instead, he bolted through the vestry with the speed and sureness of a man who knows every inch of his ground. We pelted after him, Holmes leading, myself close behind, our boots hammering on the ancient stones. Out through the vestry door and into the churchyard we pounded, the fog thick as wool around us, reducing the world to a grey tunnel through which we ran half-blind. But Morcar kept to the hedge fence with the practised instinct of the countryman, making for the river path where the fog would be thickest, and where I had no doubt he had some means of escape arranged. The path descended sharply toward the water, and here the footing became treacherous, slick with mud and littered with roots that reached up like grasping fingers. Holmes, however, was like a bloodhound on a scent. He seemed to know by instinct which way Morcar had turned, and we closed the distance with every stride. At the broken landing, where old wooden steps led down to the water's edge, Morcar turned at bay. His silver-knobbed cane came up, not as an aid to walking, but as a weapon, and I saw now that it was weighted at the head. The lion's face, carved in the ivory, seemed to snarl in the fog-filtered moonlight. "Back!" he commanded, his urbane mask slipping to reveal something cold and dangerous beneath. "I will crack the skull of the first man who comes near me." But Holmes did not pause. His own Malacca stick flashed once, twice, a display of single-stick technique that would not have disgraced a master of that arcane art, and the blows were delivered with such clinical precision that Morcar had no chance to defend. The first struck his wrist, sending the weighted cane spinning into the darkness. The second took him behind the knees, and he collapsed among the withies and reeds that fringed the landing, his breath exploding from his lungs in a great whoosh. I was upon him in an instant, my revolver pressed to his temple, while I secured his hands with my belt. He did not resist, but neither did he show any sign of fear or remorse. His breathing was even, regular, as if he had merely been engaged in some brisk but not unreasonable exercise. From the water beyond came a soft splash, and by the faint light we saw his cane bobbing slowly on the current, its silver knob catching the moon for a moment, before the river claimed it and bore it away into darkness, a drowning oracle whose counsel had come too late. Within the hour, we had them all secured in the vicarage. Jericho sat in sullen silence in the vicar's study, his long musician's fingers working ceaselessly at the rope that bound them, though he made no serious attempt to escape. The city ruffian, who gave his name as Tom Wicks and claimed to be a lighterman from Rotherhithe, nursed a bruised skull in the pantry, guarded by a wide-eyed Mrs. Hudson's local equivalent, and a stout farmer whom grief had roused from his bed. And Caleb Morcar reclined in the drawing-room with an air of studied composure, as if he were merely paying a social call that had extended somewhat beyond the customary hour. The Reverend Lithe hovered in the hallway, wringing his hands and murmuring prayers or imprecations, I could not quite determine which. Miss Vale had been summoned, and sat now with grief, her hand clasped in his, her face transformed by relief and something deeper, a vindication of faith that I found profoundly moving. Holmes stood before the fire in the vicar's study, his face begrimed with the dust and cobwebs of our struggle, but his eyes bright with the satisfaction of successful conclusion. He had cleaned his hands with meticulous care, a ritual he always performed at the end of a case, and now he lit his pipe and regarded our prisoners with an expression that mingled scientific curiosity with something approaching contempt. "Gentlemen," Morcar said, breaking the silence with that smooth, modulated voice that had served him so well in parish councils and business dealings, "you do not know what you do. You have interfered in matters far beyond your comprehension, and I promise you that consequences will follow." Holmes regarded him with a look that would have flayed oak. The contempt in his grey eyes was palpable, withering. "On the contrary, Mr. Morcar," he replied, his voice carrying the cutting edge of absolute certainty. "We know precisely what we do. We have apprehended 3 men engaged in the systematic looting of antiquities, using a consecrated church as a warehouse and a murder to protect their enterprise. We have done so with evidence that will satisfy any court in England, and we have done so before you could shift blame entirely onto an innocent curate whose only crime was to love his church too well and observe too carefully." Outside, the first faint paling of the east had begun to wash the tower stones, that peculiar pre-dawn grey that is neither night nor day, but something suspended between. In its wan light, I could see through the window the chalk markings Holmes had made upon the nave floor, and around them the telltale traces of his lamp-black experiment. Dark smudges where the stone's breathing had deposited the powder, pale lines where the flour had been drawn down into the passage below. The church had exhaled its secret at last, and like all lungs long, constrained by deception and violence, it seemed relieved to have done so. There was a stillness to the morning that felt like absolution, as if St. Anselm's itself had been shriven of some burden it had carried unwillingly. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, perhaps you would be so good as to send word to the county constabulary. Inspector Bradley of Guildford knows me. Mention my name, and he will come, with all necessary dispatch. Until then, we must maintain our guard." I dispatched young Jem on this errand. The lad was fairly bursting with pride and energy, and returned to find Holmes already beginning what I knew would be a lengthy explanation. The Reverend Lythe had composed himself sufficiently to listen, and Grieve sat forward with intense attention, though he kept Miss Vale's hand firmly clasped in his own. "The essential elements," Holmes began, settling into his exposition with evident pleasure, "have been present from the beginning, had we eyes to see them. A church called Hollow, a sexton dead in suspicious circumstances, a curate suspected of pecuniary motives he did not possess, and underlying it all, that most reliable of human motivations, greed." He moved to the window and gazed out at the emerging dawn. "The way runs but a short walk from your south wall, Mr. Lythe. A culvert, very old, perhaps dating to the Danish occupation, or even earlier, links the river to an ancient vault beneath your nave. When the Benedictine monks departed centuries ago, that passage fell into disuse and was eventually forgotten, sealed over when the nave was repaved in later centuries. But it was not destroyed. It waited, Watson, as all such things wait, for someone with the wit to discover it and the wickedness to use it." "But how did they find it?" Grieve asked. "The passage must have been sealed for hundreds of years." "Not so sealed as all that," Holmes replied. "Mr. Morcar, whose mercantile interests extend, I have learned, to the trade in antiquities, made a study of local history some years ago. Not from scholarly interest, but from the systematic acquisitiveness of the collector who knows that great treasures are sometimes found in unexpected places. He discovered references in medieval documents to a monk's road running beneath St. Anselm's, cryptic allusions that most would dismiss as legend or misunderstanding. But Morcar is a patient man, and patient men are often the most dangerous." Holmes turned back to face us, his pipe trailing a thin plume of smoke towards the ceiling. He began by examining the church with great care during his legitimate duties as the church warden. The hollow sound beneath the nave confirmed his suspicions. The salt tang at the flag seam, which you, Mr. Lythe, must have noticed 1,000 times without understanding its significance, told him that tidal water reached the vicinity. He reasoned correctly that the passage must terminate at the river. "But to open it," I interjected, "to find the mechanism, Watson, that required time and careful observation. The flagstone, you see, was not simply sealed over, but was in fact a concealed access point, the monk's trap, as such features are sometimes called in ecclesiastical architecture. The mechanism was ancient but sound, requiring only the discovery of the hidden pin that released it. Morcar found this, I suspect, during one of those long evenings when a church warden might legitimately remain alone in the church, ostensibly examining accounts or inspecting for repairs." Holmes paused to relight his pipe, a sure sign that he was approaching the heart of his explanation. Once opened, the passage proved to be everything he had hoped, a direct route from the river to the heart of the church, traversable. by a man of moderate agility, equipped with a winch system for raising heavy objects. Do you see the genius of it? A boat arrives at night from London, carrying items that certain unscrupulous dealers have purchased from equally unscrupulous sources. Stolen church plate, Roman artifacts illegally excavated, medieval manuscripts removed from private collections. These items cannot be easily transported by conventional means without arousing suspicion. But a boat on the way, a quick transfer to the underground passage, storage beneath the church until such time as the goods can be legitimately discovered or sold. It was a smuggling operation of remarkable efficiency. "And Jericho?" Grieve asked, his voice tight with the pain of betrayal. "Mr. Jericho was recruited for his debts and his access," Holmes said, not without a trace of pity. "A man drowning in obligations is a man ripe for criminal employment. He provided the wax for making impressions of keys, the vestry key, certainly, and probably others. He used his musical practice as cover for nocturnal activity in the church, and he operated the signal system." "The bell," I said, "the auxiliary line on the tenor bell." "Precisely. A simple code. 1 tap for all clear, 2 for danger, perhaps 3 for abort the operation. From the river landing, one could hear these signals clearly. From the village, they would be indistinguishable from the ordinary sounds of an old building settling or the wind in the tower." Holmes moved to stand before Morcar, who had listened to this exposition with an expression of sardonic resignation. But then came Abel Pike, poor, honest, observant Abel Pike, who knew every stone and shadow of St. Anselm's. He noticed the wax on the vestry key. He heard the bell speak when no hand should have been on the rope. Perhaps he glimpsed a light where no light should be, or encountered Mr. Wicks here, emerging from a place where no man should emerge. Whatever the specific trigger, he began to investigate. "And they killed him," Miss Vale said softly, her voice trembling with anger and sorrow. "They killed him," Holmes confirmed. "Wicks, I suspect, delivered the blow. A weighted cosh, or perhaps Morcar's own silver-knobbed cane, which I noted bore fresh dents inconsistent with ordinary use as a walking stick. The murder occurred not in the tower, but near the passage entrance, where Pike had come to investigate the nocturnal disturbances." He struggled. The brick dust beneath his nails attests to that. "The culverts, you see, are lined with Roman tile, and Pike grasped at these as he fought for his life. But he was an old man facing a younger, stronger opponent, and the outcome was never in doubt." The room had fallen utterly silent. Even the crackling of the fire seemed muted, as if the flames themselves were listening. "The body," Holmes continued relentlessly, "was carried to the belfry and dropped at dawn to simulate an accidental fall. But our murderers could not control every detail. The pattern of injury was wrong for a fall, concentrated in the brow rather than distributed across the body. The absence of massive skeletal trauma was inconsistent with a 40-foot drop, and they failed to clean the brick dust from beneath his nails. Small oversights, but in aggregate they spoke a language clear as print to anyone trained to read it." Holmes turned away from Morcar and addressed the room at large. The subsequent campaign to cast suspicion upon Mr. Grieve was despicable, but logical. A curate with reforming zeal, a man who spent irregular hours in the church, who had access to keys, he made a convenient scapegoat. Whispers about debts, which were in fact Jericho's, not Grieve's, were allowed to circulate. The unlocked alms box suggested pecuniary motives. It was a tissue of lies, but lies carefully woven to create a pattern that might satisfy a lazy investigation or a superstitious community. "But you saw through it," Grieve said, his voice rough with emotion. "I saw through it because I looked," Holmes replied simply. "That is the whole art of detection, Mr. Grieve, to look at what others see and observe what they do not. The salt on the flagstones, the paraffin on the ladder rung, the waxed key, the spliced signal line, the brick dust beneath the nails. Each element was trivial in itself, but together they formed a coherent narrative that admitted of only one interpretation." He moved back to the fire and knocked out his pipe against the hearth. "The final proof came last night with our little experiment. The lampblack and flour showed definitively that the flagstone breathes, that air moves through the seam as the stone is raised and lowered. The chalk marks revealed the structure of the vault beneath, and the confrontation itself provided the testimony of action. 3 men, coordinated in purpose, executing a well-rehearsed procedure for criminal ends." Dawn had fully broken now, and with it came the sound of hoofbeats on the road, Inspector Bradley and his constables responding to Jem's summons with gratifying speed. Within a quarter hour, our prisoners were being conveyed to Guildford under guard, Wicks sullen and Jericho broken, but Morcar maintaining to the last that expression of urbane unconcern, as if he were departing for a business appointment rather than the assizes. Chapter 5. The Gathering in the Nave. By mid-morning, the grey November light had strengthened to something approaching pale sunshine, and St. Anselm's stood, revealed not as a place of menace, but as what it had always been. An ancient building that had witnessed centuries of human folly and devotion, now restored to its proper purpose. Inspector Bradley, a solid man with the methodical intelligence of the best provincial police, had completed his preliminary investigation and requested that we assemble in the nave for what Holmes privately termed the revelation, that formal reconstruction of events which satisfied both law and public curiosity. The dignitaries of the parish gathered. The vicar, still pale but recovering his composure. Thomas Grieve, vindicated but sombre with the knowledge of how close he had come to ruin. Miss Vale, her hand never far from her fiancé's arm, and various worthies of the village, including the innkeeper Makepeace and several farmers whose faces bore the weathered skepticism of men who had seen much and believed little without hard proof. Young Jem Stokes stood near the font, fidgeting with pride and trying unsuccessfully to look modest. Holmes had earlier presented him with a half-crown and the assurance that his courage and quick thinking had been essential to the case's resolution, a commendation that had turned the boy's face scarlet and rendered him temporarily speechless. Holmes stood by the lectern, one finger resting lightly upon the chalk-marked stone that had been the gateway to the criminal underworld. He had cleaned himself thoroughly, and appeared now in his usual immaculate condition, though I noted the signs of fatigue around his eyes that spoke of a long night without sleep. "Mr. Leith," said he, addressing the vicar, with the courtesy he always showed to the genuinely innocent, "your church has been made the hub of a very old and very profitable trade, the movement of contraband goods and latterly of stolen antiquities. The way runs but a short walk from your south wall, a culvert older than your foundation, dating perhaps to Roman times or to the Danish occupation, links the river to an ancient vault beneath this nave. When the Benedictine monks departed in the 16th century, the passage fell into disuse and was eventually concealed beneath newer paving. But it was not destroyed, and our adversaries discovered and revived it for their own purposes. Morcar, who had been brought back under guard to hear this formal accusation, stood with 2 constables flanking him. His face, in the strengthening light, showed its first traces of genuine unease. The urbane mask was slipping, revealing beneath it the calculation of a man reassessing his position. "Bold conjecture, Mr. Holmes," he said, but his voice lacked its former conviction. "Not conjecture," Holmes returned, his tone hardening. "Proof, demonstration, evidence that will satisfy any jury in England." He gestured to the flagstone at his feet. "The salt tang at this seam, detectable to anyone with a trained nose. Salt from tidal water that seeps through the passage during spring floods. The draught perceptible at the chancel step when the stone is raised, cold air flowing from the river. The brick dust beneath Abel Pike's nails, mica-bearing clay from the Roman tiles that line the culvert walls. The spliced signal line in the tenor bell, a smuggler's device for coordinating movements between the river landing and the church interior. The organist's beeswax upon the vestry key, used to take a quiet impression from which a duplicate could be made. Each element is individually suggestive. Together, they form a chain of evidence as solid as the stone beneath our feet." He paused, allowing his words to settle in the minds of his audience. The nave was utterly silent, save for the distant calling of rooks in the churchyard elms. "The alms-box," Holmes continued, "was not their primary goal, though they helped themselves when opportunity arose. Their true prize was larger and more sophisticated. Crates of stolen goods were conveyed by night from London via the Way, a route that avoids the main roads and the scrutiny of customs officials. At the landing below, the crates were offloaded and carried to the culvert entrance. From there, they were winched along the ancient passage, a distance of perhaps 200 feet, and lifted here into the vault space beneath the nave. The operation required coordination, strength, and nerve, but it could be accomplished in less than an hour with practiced efficiency. While Jericho's nocturnes covered the noise, Inspector Bradley interjected, his notebook open and his pencil moving rapidly. "Precisely. An organist practicing late is unremarkable in a church. The sounds of the instrument would mask the scraping of crates, the rattle of chains, the inevitable noises of men working in confined spaces. It was, I confess, an elegant solution to a difficult logistical problem." Holmes turned his attention to Jericho, who sat now on a pew with his head in his hands. The organist looked up at the sound of his name, and I saw in his face the particular desolation of a man who has betrayed everything he once valued. "Mr. Jericho," Holmes said, not without gentleness, "was recruited for his debts and his access, as I have explained. But I do not think he entered this conspiracy with full knowledge of its extent. They promised him his debts would be cleared, a seductive offer to a drowning man. They told him, perhaps, that the goods were merely contraband, not stolen, a distinction that might salve a guilty conscience. But when Abel Pike was murdered, he found himself complicit in something far darker than he had imagined." Jericho's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely audible. "They said it was only goods being moved to avoid excise duty. I swear I never knew they would kill anyone." When Pike fell, when I learned what had happened, his voice broke. I should have come forward then. God forgive me. I should have spoken. You should have, Holmes agreed quietly. But fear is a powerful motive for silence, and Morcar is an expert in cultivating fear. You will answer for your complicity, Mr. Jericho, but the law distinguishes between degrees of guilt, and your testimony will be valuable. He returned his attention to the assembly. Abel Pike discovered them through a combination of observation and duty. He was a man who knew this church as he knew the palm of his own hand. He noticed the waxed key, a small thing, but wrong. He heard the bell sound when no hand should have been upon the rope. Perhaps he encountered Wicks or Morcar moving through the church at an unseasonable hour. Whatever the specific trigger, he began to investigate, and his investigation led him to this stone. Holmes tapped the flagstone with his foot. He was here, probably crouched as I am now, when Wicks struck him from behind. The blow, delivered with a weighted instrument, probably Morcar's own cane, fractured the skull above the right ear. Pike struggled, grasping at the culvert walls as he was dragged toward the passage entrance, but he was an old man facing a stronger opponent, and the outcome was never in doubt. He died here, gentlemen, in this sacred space, murdered for the crime of being honest and observant. The vicar made a small sound of distress, and several of the parishioners crossed themselves. The weight of Pike's death, which had been abstract, became suddenly and terribly concrete. His body, Holmes continued relentlessly, was carried to the belfry and dropped at dawn to simulate an accidental fall. It was a calculated deception, but one that failed to account for forensic detail. The bruising pattern was inconsistent with a fall. The absence of massive skeletal trauma suggested the body was dead or dying before it struck the ground. And the brick dust beneath the nails, that most damning detail, spoke of a struggle in a place where no struggle should have occurred. Holmes's grey eyes fixed upon Morcar with an intensity that made the churchwarden flinch. You, Mr. Morcar, orchestrated this entire enterprise. You discovered the passage through historical research. You recruited Jericho for his musical cover and his access to keys. You engaged wickies for the heavy work and the violent necessities that might arise. You organized the logistics, the boats from London, the coordination of timing, the storage and subsequent disposal of the stolen goods. And when Abel Pike threatened your operation, you authorized his murder. You cannot prove, Morcar began, but Holmes cut him off with a gesture. Cannot prove? On the contrary, Mr. Morcar, I can prove every particular. Why did you walk the river path before breakfast on the morning we met you? Not for exercise. A gentleman of your standing does not take constitutional walks in November dawn, unless driven by necessity. You were checking the landing, ensuring that the previous night's operation had left no traces. Your cane bore fresh river mud at 11 in the morning when the lanes were dry. Your cravat, that distinctive cornflower blue, left a thread upon the crate that even now sits in the vault below. He paused, and in the silence I heard Inspector Bradley's pencil scratching rapidly across the pages of his notebook. Shall we examine that crate now? Holmes inquired, his voice dangerously soft. Shall we descend into your vault and inventory its contents? I think we shall find items of considerable interest. Greek amphora, perhaps, or Roman silver, or illuminated manuscripts that match the descriptions in various theft reports filed with the Metropolitan Police over the past 18 months. At this, Morcar's composure finally cracked. His face, which had maintained its mask of confident denial, suddenly sagged. He seemed to age 10 years in an instant, the weight of his crimes pressing down upon him like a physical burden. "Mr. Holmes," Inspector Bradley said, rising from his pew, "if you would be so good as to demonstrate this passage and its contents, I believe we shall have all the evidence necessary for the assizes." Holmes nodded and turned to young Jem. "Fetch lanterns, lad, and mind the rope. We shall need 3 stout men to work the mechanism safely." What followed was a careful archaeological expedition into the depths beneath St. Anselm's. With Grieve and 2 of the farmers providing muscle, the flagstone was raised fully for the first time in our presence, revealing the square shaft that descended into darkness. Iron rungs set into the wall provided a ladder, and the air that rose from below was exactly as Holmes had described, cold, damp, redolent of river and ancient stone. Holmes descended first, his lantern casting fantastic shadows on the brick-lined walls. I followed, and then Inspector Bradley, leaving the parish worthies to peer down into the opening with a mixture of fascination and horror. The shaft descended perhaps 15 feet to a horizontal passage, tall enough for a man to walk upright if he stooped slightly, wide enough for 2 to pass if they turned sideways. The walls were indeed lined with Roman tile, their herringbone pattern clearly visible in our lantern light. The floor was worn smooth by centuries of use, first by monks, perhaps, and then by smugglers of various eras, and finally by Morcar's criminal enterprise. At intervals along the walls, iron brackets held the remnants of ancient torches, and a more modern addition, a system of pulleys and chains, ran along the ceiling, terminating in a winch mechanism near the church end. We followed the passage toward the river, our footsteps echoing strangely in that confined space. After perhaps 200 feet, the passage widened into a small chamber, and here we found what Holmes had predicted. 3 wooden crates bearing Greek, lettering and customs stamps from various Mediterranean ports, a smaller box containing wrapped objects that proved to be medieval church plate, and a canvas sack filled with manuscripts whose illuminated capitals glowed even in the dim light of our lanterns. "Stolen from the British Museum stores last March," Holmes observed, examining one of the manuscripts, "and these amphora, reported missing from a private collection in Athens. The plate is from various country churches, melted benefactions and the like. A comprehensive inventory of cultural theft, gentlemen, and all stored beneath a consecrated church whose very sanctity provided both cover and irony." Inspector Bradley made careful notes of each item, while Holmes explained the probable logistics of the operation. The passage terminated at a concealed opening in the riverbank, disguised by overhanging willows and accessible only at low tide. A small boat could moor there unseen, offload its cargo, and depart before dawn with minimal risk of detection. When we emerged back into the nave, blinking in the now bright morning light, the faces that greeted us told me that our discoveries had been thoroughly described by those who had remained above. The sense of violation was palpable, not merely the violation of law, but the deeper offence against the sanctity of a place where generations had sought refuge from the world's wickedness. Holmes confronted Morcar once more, and in his voice I heard contempt mixed with something like pity. Why a churchwarden? He mused aloud, though he clearly knew the answer. Because the parish plate offers a convenient pretext for your presence at odd hours. Because your position places you above suspicion, a pillar of the community, a generous benefactor, a man of substance and reputation. And most eloquent reason of all, because the proceeds of your trade could be laundered as benefactions. That silver candlestick on your dining sideboard, Mr. Morcar, the Roman work with the dolphin at the stem, came up through this hole last Tuesday, did it not? Young Jem saw it glimmer beneath your cloak, and thought the devil had ceased to whisper and begun to shine. All eyes swung to the bell-boy, who backed against the gallery beam, then squared his narrow shoulders with visible effort. "I seen it, sir," he said to the vicar, his voice wavering but determined. "Saw it clear as day, only it were night, and I thought it were something unholy. And I writ to Mr. Grieve, only I put they, because I didn't know who to trust, and he's a gentleman, and I'm just—" The sentence faltered and died. "Because you are brave," Holmes said, moving to stand beside the boy. "Braver than most men thrice your age, Jem Stokes. You saw what others missed, and you had the courage to report it even when you did not fully understand what you had witnessed. You have more than earned your half-crown, lad. You have earned the gratitude of this entire parish." The boy's eyes filled with tears that he blinked back furiously, and I saw several of the farmers nodding with approval. In that moment, young Jem was transformed from a mere bell-boy into something approaching a local hero, and I thought he would carry the memory of Holmes's commendation for the rest of his life. Morcar, seeing that all pretense was useless, attempted one final gambit. "Where is your river, Mr. Holmes?" he demanded, his voice rising with desperate bravado. "Where is your vault? Where are your antiquities? You present theories and conjectures." But Holmes merely smiled, that thin, cold smile that I had seen him direct at cornered criminals 100 times before. He raised one hand, and at his signal, the two vergers, who had been standing ready with tools provided by Inspector Bradley, moved to the flagstone. Under Grieve's direction, and with Jem dancing impatiently from foot to foot, they worked the hidden pin that Holmes had earlier identified. At Holmes's nod, they lifted the flag, and the Nave inhaled. Cool, damp air rose from the black throat of the passage, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of the river and of ancient, undisturbed spaces. Within the opening, our lanterns revealed the roped sides of the hand-winch, the mud scored with boot scrapes, and set back upon a stone ledge, clearly visible to all, one of the crates we had examined below. This one, stenciled with Greek characters, and bearing a customs stamp from Piraeus. In the side of the crate, a splinter had caught and torn free a thread of fabric. Holmes, producing his tweezers with the flourish of a conjurer completing a trick, plucked it free and held it up between finger and thumb. In the morning light streaming through the eastern windows, the thread's cornflower blue colour was unmistakable, a perfect match for Morcar's distinctive cravat. "You asked for your river, Mr. Morcar," Holmes said quietly. "It has sent its calling card, and unless I am very much mistaken, a careful examination of your wardrobe will reveal a cravat with a missing thread from precisely this location." The churchwarden's shoulders sagged. The fight went out of him like air from a punctured bladder, and he stood now as what he truly was. Not a pillar of the community, but a common criminal whose cleverness had been insufficient to his ambition. Inspector Bradley stepped forward and formally charged all 3 prisoners with theft, smuggling, and, in Morcar's and Wicks's cases, with the murder of Abel Pike. As they were led away, Jericho weeping openly, and Morcar maintaining a bitter silence, the assembled parishioners watched with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. There was justice in this moment, but also the painful recognition of how thoroughly they had been deceived. When the county constabulary had completed their formalities and taken their prisoners away, St. Anselm's seemed to exhale, a corporeal sense of relief, as if the building itself had been, labouring under an intolerable burden, and was now freed. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the place dissipated like morning fog before sun, and what remained was simply an old church, beautiful in its ancient proportions, hallowed by centuries of worship, and now restored to its proper purpose. The Reverend Lythe, whose shame at his own blindness was a palpable thing, tottered to a pew and sat heavily. "I should have seen," he murmured, addressing no one in particular. "I should have known." "You saw what they wished you to see," Holmes said, not unkindly. "They exploited your trust, Mr. Lythe, and trust is not a failing, but a virtue. The fault lies not with those who believe in human goodness, but with those who abuse that belief for their own ends." Thomas Grieve stood with Miss Vale's hand tucked securely into the crook of his arm, and in their faces I saw the transformation that comes when a great weight is lifted, when suspicion gives way to vindication, when fear yields to relief. They would marry, I had no doubt, and the memory of this dark episode would fade gradually into family history, becoming with time merely a story told to grandchildren about how their grandfather had once been falsely accused and brilliantly defended. Holmes, with his characteristic distaste for accolades and emotional scenes, had already retreated to the west door, where he stood gazing out at the churchyard with that distant expression that indicated his mind was already moving beyond this case to whatever problem might next engage his formidable intellect. I found him there, searching the thinning fog, as if within it lay the next mystery, the next challenge to his unique talents. "You had Morcar from the first," I ventured, though I suspected this was not entirely true. He turned and smiled slightly, one of those rare, genuine expressions of satisfaction that illuminated his usually austere features. "Not from the first, Watson, though earlier than most. He revealed himself through a series of small choices, each individually defensible, but collectively damning. His patronage of the facts, the way he dismissed legitimate concerns as superstition, his immediate assumption that Grieve was guilty, a classic diversion tactic, directing attention away from himself, but most tellingly, his cane. The mud on the ferrule. Precisely. It was of foreign make, Italian, judging by the style of the carving, expensive and distinctive. The mud upon its ferrule at 11 in the morning was fresh, and bore the characteristic composition of river-bottom clay. The lanes were dry, the church paths were dry. Yet Morcar's cane bore fresh mud. Therefore he had walked the river path that morning, and one doesn't go to the river before breakfast in November without compelling purpose. He paused, lighting his pipe, a ritual of transition that marked the end of a case and the return to ordinary life. Moreover, his response to questions was too smooth, too calculated. Guilty men often give themselves away, not through nervousness, but through excessive calm. They have rehearsed their stories, prepared their defenses, and in doing so, they create performances that lack the natural irregularity of truth. And the cornflower cravat, I asked, for that detail had seemed almost too convenient. Ah, yes, that was partially luck, I confess. But luck favours the prepared mind. I had noted the distinctive colour when we first met him, and when we examined the vault, I specifically looked for any trace of fabric. Smugglers and thieves are careful, Watson, but no one is perfect. That single thread told me that Morcar had personally handled the crates, that he had been in physical contact with the goods rather than merely directing operations from a distance. It placed him at the scene, and once a man is placed at the scene, other questions become easier to answer. We stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the last of the fog burned away, and the village emerged fully into the November sunlight. Somewhere a church bell, not St. Anselm's, but from a neighbouring parish, tolled the hour with measured dignity, and I was reminded that beyond this small drama of crime and detection, the great machinery of English life continued its ancient rhythms. "Come, Watson," Holmes said at last. "Our train leaves at noon, and Mrs. Hudson will scold if we are late for dinner. This case is concluded, recorded in your mental notebook for future publication, and we must return to the ever-accumulating correspondence that awaits us in Baker Street." "You will allow me to publish this account?" I asked, for Holmes was notoriously particular about which cases I might commit to print. "I see no reason why not. Change the names if you wish, though the principals will face sufficient public judgment at their trial. It contains all the elements your readers seem to favour: an ancient mystery, a wronged innocent, a midnight confrontation, and a satisfying resolution. Omit, perhaps, the more technical details of the lampblack experiment. Such things, while scientifically sound, tend to bore the general reader. We collected our bags from the inn, bade farewell to the grateful Miss Vale and Grieve, and were driven back to the station by Makepeace, who was bursting with questions that Holmes deflected with practised ease. The train bore us back toward London, and as the Surrey countryside gave way to the outskirts of the metropolis, I found myself reflecting on the case and its implications. Here had been a crime of surprising sophistication, conducted beneath the noses of an entire community, protected by the very sanctity of the place it violated. It had required Holmes's particular genius to see through the carefully constructed facade of ghosts and superstition to the mercenary reality beneath. And once again, I was reminded that his methods, observation, deduction, and unflinching rationality, were the best weapons civilized society possessed against the forces of disorder and greed.